Some point in the early 20th century, the fate of hundreds of millions of people was decided in rooms they would never enter, by men who would never live with the consequences. No cameras, no public debate, no vote, just maps on tables, pencils in hand, and a belief that the world was falling apart too fast to wait. Most people assume borders are ancient, that they emerged naturally, shaped by culture, language, and history over centuries. But many of the borders that define today's wars are younger than the grandparents of the people fighting inside them. They were drawn in a rush, not after peace, during panic. When World War I ended, history did not slow down, it accelerated. Empires collapsed almost overnight, governments vanished, armies disintegrated, entire regions were left without authority, and the people in power were terrified of what would come next. Communism had just taken Russia, workers were striking across Europe, nationalist movements were igniting across continents, colonial subjects were demanding independence. To leaders in London and Paris, it felt as if the world itself was slipping out of control. So they made a decision that would shape the next century. They would redraw the world quickly, they would impose order immediately, and they would fix the details later. This episode is not about why borders fail. You already know the damage. This episode is about the moment the damage was designed. It is about who sat in those rooms, what they believed, what they ignored, and why the lines they thought were temporary became permanent. Because once those lines were drawn, there was no rewind button, and the world has been living inside that decision ever since. In 1919, the victors of World War I gathered in Paris. The Paris Peace Conference would shape the 20th century more than any battle ever could. Dozens of new borders would be created here. Entire countries would come into existence. Yet despite its global consequences, the conference itself was not global. Britain and France dominated the room. Their empires were exhausted but intact. They arrived with clear priorities: protect influence, secure trade routes, and prevent rival powers from filling the vacuum left by collapsed empires. The United States spoke the language of ideals, self-determination, democracy, freedom, but lacked the political will to challenge imperial interests beyond Europe. And the people whose lives would be most affected by these decisions were not present. Arabs, Kurds, Africans, and millions of others were not invited to decide their future. They were discussed instead, reduced to regions, to populations, to problems. Maps replaced people. Large paper maps were rolled out across tables. Colored pencils marked zones of influence. Borders were debated not in terms of identity or history, but in terms of logistics. Could this line be defended? Could this territory be governed cheaply? Would this border prevent future European wars? Straight lines were easier to manage. The men drawing them believed they were being practical. They believed complexity was dangerous. And above all, they believed the world needed order immediately, even if that order was flawed. One of the most influential figures in this process was British diplomat Sir Mark Sykes. Young, confident, and deeply convinced that empire understood the world better than the people living inside it, Sykes approached the Middle East as a technical challenge. In private correspondence, he described the division of Ottoman lands as something that could simply be sliced up, not negotiated, not debated, sliced. His French counterpart, François-Georges Picot, shared the same mindset. Together, in 1916, before the war had even ended, they secretly negotiated what became known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It divided Ottoman territory into British and French zones of influence without consulting a single local population. The assumption was simple. These borders were temporary. They would stabilize the region, they would buy time, they would be adjusted later, and this is the moment most people misunderstand. The men who drew these borders did not believe they were making permanent decisions. They believed the future would fix their mistakes. They believed later generations, calmer, wiser, more stable, would redraw the lines properly. That assumption changes everything, because the real tragedy of modern borders is not that they were drawn badly, it's that they were never meant to last. Yet everything that followed treated them as if they were final. At the Paris Peace Conference, American President Woodrow Wilson spoke passionately about self-determination. His speeches inspired movements across the world. But inside the conference halls, ideals collided with fear. When asked about colonial populations, Wilson admitted that many societies were, in his words, not yet ready for self-government. The phrase sounded cautious, it became decisive. Self-determination was celebrated in Europe. It was postponed everywhere else. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George was more honest in private. He understood that ideals mattered less than stability. Borders needed to function immediately. Consent could come later, or not at all. French officials echoed the same logic. One administrator described the mandate system not as a path to independence, but as guidance, a word that disguised control as responsibility. None of these men believed they were creating permanent systems. They believed they were buying time. But time does not freeze. As empires withdrew, they did not redesign the states they had created. They handed them off. The borders remained. The structures stayed intact. What changed was who controlled them. Local elites inherited systems built for control, not consent. Police forces expanded. Intelligence services grew. Emergency laws became permanent. Stability mattered more than legitimacy. Temporary systems became inherited traps. The borders themselves began to shape political psychology. Power was no longer negotiated locally. It was centralized. Political authority became a single prize. Whoever controlled controlled the state, controlled survival. Fear entered the system. The men who drew the borders never saw this moment. Mark Sykes died in 1919, just months after the Paris Peace Conference. François-Georges Picot faded from history. Woodrow Wilson left office politically broken. Their decisions remain. As decades passed, the original assumption that borders would be revised quietly disappeared. International institutions recognized the lines. International law protected them. Sovereignty became sacred. What was provisional became permanent, and once that happened, there was no safe way back. The world learned to manage instability instead of resolving it. Peacekeeping replaced redesign. Aid replaced reform. Ceasefires replaced solutions. Conflicts did not end. They paused. Generations grew up inside systems defined by emergency. Refugee camps became permanent. Entire lives unfolded inside borders that had never been designed to hold societies together. The goal had been to prevent chaos. The result was frozen conflict. Borders drawn under panic were never meant to carry the weight they now bear. They were scaffolding mistaken for foundations, stopgaps mistaken for structures, and yet they remain. Which leads to the question most people never ask. If these borders were never meant to last, why are they treated as sacred? And if they clearly don't work, why does the world keep defending them? Because in the next episode, we confront the moment this became irreversible. When international law froze borders in place, when sovereignty became untouchable, and when redesign quietly disappeared from the global imagination. Once you understand how that happened, the modern world stops feeling chaotic. It starts feeling trapped.